Radio. A biography or a long history, a picture book filled with history. Was it a fiction book or one that helps you to cook? Call us now, we'll talk about your book. So travel tales or a book about whales, reading poetry or the dictionary, onto a fantasy place or a book about space. Call us now, let's talk about your book. Now where are my glasses? Okay, page 1.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to A Kind Voice on Books. I'm your host, Eden Blackwell, and tonight's episode number 7, is about storytelling. Everyone has a story. Plenty of people have lots of stories. Some of us make up stories for others. Call in tonight if you'd like to share yours. Our guest line is 347-850-8907. Joining me tonight to talk about stories and to talk with you about your story is Dr. John Brailsford. Dr. John is a trained therapist in the Provo area of Utah, and he's got some experience with telling stories. And instead of introducing him more fully, I'd really like for Dr. John to tell his story. How are you doing, John?
Doing great. Dr.
Well,
John takes me back. I actually was trained in the panhandle of Florida and southern Georgia, and they called me Dr. John. I tried to explain to them I didn't have my PhD yet, I wasn't, and they just said, let us call you Dr. John, and so that's what they called me back in the day, before I'd even earned the title. So.
And have you've earned it now, right?
I have, back in the 90s actually. I graduated from Florida State back in about 1998, and not long after that became a therapist and have been practicing off and on ever since. So,
well, how has that brought you around to knowing a little something about storytelling?
Yeah, well, storytelling, that's kind of what I do for fun on the side sometimes, but really early on in my career as a therapist, what I realized was in almost every session, I was sharing stories. The thing about therapy is sometimes you'll want to share information that will be useful to the client that they can take and then they can use to transform their lives or learn to, do it maybe a better way, a more effective way. And it's hard, you can't just tell them straight up, hey, do this, because often there's a resistance to that, particularly if it's really different from what they've been doing. Sometimes when things go wrong, we don't try to find a new way. We try to do the old way with greater intensity. So
right.
If we respond to someone who's annoying us by yelling at them, we think, and it doesn't work, we think to ourselves, well, maybe I need to yell a little louder. And so next time we try it a little louder. And obviously that doesn't work. And over time you want to say, hey, what's an alternative? And when you just tell them the alternative, sometimes they resist that. But sometimes if you tell them the alternative in a story, maybe a story about someone else or in a different time, or maybe even a symbolic story, a story of an animal or an imaginary figure, all of a sudden their mind opens, their heart opens to maybe a new way of life, and they're willing to consider it in ways they wouldn't have if you just told them straight up. So that's kind of what led me to really get interested in how can you share a meaningful story in such a way that it really, gets in there and influences someone in their lives. And so it took me from, the therapeutic use of storytelling into more of the art form over time.
So you went looking for technique?
Yeah,
or...
first of all, I didn't even know there was an art form. And really, there probably was a time when it wasn't even considered an art form. It was just what we do as human beings. We naturally tell stories. And our brains and our hearts naturally latch on to the meaning in stories, easier than just being told straight up. So it made sense, but over the years, especially in the last century, maybe in the last couple centuries, what we've found is people really started to get serious about, what makes a story a really good story, or what makes the telling of that story really meaningful to the people who listen to that story. And so I wanted to know that, too, because I thought it would help me become a much more effective therapist. As it turns out, it helped me become a much more effective husband and father, a much more effective friend and family member. It just helped me share experiences in such a way that people could identify more with what I was talking about. So storytelling, the art form, is really sort of an interactive art, and I would say the two mediums it uses are words and actions. To kind of reveal meaning in such a way that the listener becomes engaged and is able to understand and apply the experience to their lives. So if I could define it, that I'd probably add those elements. And eventually that led to here in Utah. I've lived here since '06, and it led to the Storytelling Guild, which is a group of people, both professional and amateur, that get together and learn about storytelling. And it also led, to learning more about the storytelling festivals, throughout America, and gave me opportunities to go and hear people who are really good at it share their stories.
So what are those? So those some of those festivals?
The two biggest ones in North America are, first, the National Storytelling Festival. That's held every year in Jonesborough, Tennessee, and that's one of the oldest ones, and the one that people go to. People back east, that would be the one they'd want to go to, would be close to them. But the second biggest is the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival, and that's out here in Utah County, which is Provo, Orem, American Forks, little towns like that in sort of in central Utah. And so, and Timpanogos Storytelling Festival out here is just, I've gone to that a couple times, and it's just a great experience. You can learn not only about the storytelling, but you can enjoy performances. And it's really for all ages. They even have competitions of youth tellers, where, wow, kids anywhere from, 6, 7, 8 years old on up, can share their stories. And it's amazing how impactful those stories can be, even from an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, someone who's still in grade school.
So you said the Timpanogos
Festival.
Well, tell me about that. What is that?
There's a mountain that rises above the valley. It's the second biggest mountain in Utah, second highest peak. And it's called Mount Timpanogos. And my understanding is in Paiute, the word means river of rock. So it looks like a big flowing river of rock, big gray mountain towering above us, and it's very impressive. And so a lot of the things down in the valley, businesses and schools and things like that, are named after Timpanogos, and either that or Timp, as we call it for short. And so you have Timpanogos High School and Timpview High School, and you have, everything from car repair shops to flower shops, will have that in their name down in the valley below. And so it's a prominent fixture here for us, and of course the festival itself is named after it as well. So,
well, that's really cool. I mean, I suppose every place name does imply a story.
It does.
How does a town get its name? There's a town in the state in Mississippi where I live called D-Lo, D''Lo.
Uh-huh.
one of the rumored stories, it's not been authenticated, but one of the stories to explain why D-Lo is called D-Lo is that when they were surveying, it was so darn low, and it's next to the water, and it flooded, and it still floods like every year. And they're like, yeah, what do you expect? It's so darn low here, and that's,
it's
we're in
the Venice
D-Lo.
of the South, it's covered in water.
It feels a little better, I think.
Absolutely.
But names imply stories.
Exactly, and that's often how we get names, is it comes from a story. Timpanogos, the story is told of a maiden who lost her love, and the mountain actually looks like a woman laying down on her back with her face up to the clouds and her hands over her heart, and so there's even that romantic side of Timpanogos, that here's this mountain with a kind of that old Indian legend behind it, and anyway, and I always love those old stories, those old legends. So.
Yeah, I mean, they're incredible. Their ability to explain the world around us, and you said it's from a Native American tribe, and
right.
So not in a time
it's actually
of
one of
science.
the Ute tribes, and for which Utah is named, and
Ute.
Yeah, Ute, exactly.
Go figure.
So, go figure. Yeah, that's where they got the name. It actually means people of the mountain, I believe,
people
is what
of
Utah
mountain.
means. Right, or top of the mountain. People of the top of the mountain, and so Utah means the land at the top of the mountain. So. And
then there was this one mountain that looked like a lady laying down, sad and forlorn, and they named the mountain for her.
Yeah, Timpanogos, the river of rock, and you can think of a river of tears, and for lost love, so forlorn. Yeah.
Well, that definitely has a way of making everyday life a little more interesting.
Right. Yeah, she's always there.
Least.
Wherever you go, all you have to do is turn in her direction, and you can't miss her when she's 12,000 feet above sea level. So.
That's an
in fact,
awesome
a lot of people
story.
that come from back east are pretty impressed. They rarely see, have seen even in pictures mountains that size. So.
Right. Everything else is a hill.
Exactly.
Well, so you're not native to Utah then?
I actually grew up in southern Nevada. I'm a desert kid. I grew up in North Las Vegas, Nevada. So I was used to red rock and sandstone and dry weather and roadrunners and coyotes. So.
Yeah. Well, good for you. Well, I always feel like I've lived around in a few different states and different regions, and whenever I get to a new place, and if it looks really differently, so I'm from the Deep South, and I moved to the West Coast for a while, and I was just more attuned to their stories and their explanation, and
right.
their different cultures, and the stories explain that, and it seems you caught that bug too, and
absolutely, yeah, it does. It helps you adjust to a culture. It helps you. I actually have lived in Europe, and I have family in Mexico and family in Canada, and so when you in order to kind of link to them, to join with them, very often you tell stories. You tell what the experience is like living in those places, and it kind of brings you closer to home in a quicker way than just, observing what's going on. You can be brought up to speed by the stories people tell. So.
Right. And, yeah, just a quick, this is what life is like, everybody, for me,
exactly.
out here alone in this place.
Exactly. And you find some things that are unique, but what's ironic is almost always you find what's not unique. It's just very common to everyone everywhere. And that's really the biggest power of
John?
What's very common and what binds us together, as human beings. So it can be really useful in couples therapy too, or in relationship therapy where you're trying to help people overcome challenges and get closer.
I'd like to ask more questions about that. Why don't we take a quick break, everybody, and take a rest, give our callers a second to maybe think about calling in with their stories and sharing what's going on in their world and how they feel about storytelling, her cool stories. So everybody, y'all come on back, and we'll talk some more in just a few minutes.
A Kind Voice is a call-in line that lives upstream from depression hotlines. You don't need to be experiencing a crisis to call us. Our volunteers take calls on a book you read, a movie or game you saw, or just about anything you'd like to discuss. Call 800-876-2399 to speak with a Kind Voice. Our volunteers aren't professional counselors. They're kind voices who are here for you. Call 800-876-2399 or visit us at akindvoice.org.
I'll be there for you, and maybe you can be for me. With a kind voice, a few kind words, an open ear for when you need to be heard, a warm heart. We can make that choice to be a kind voice, a few kind words, an open ear for when you need to be heard, a warm heart. We can make that choice to be a kind voice.
To help raise funds in a way that serves our mission, A Kind Voice wants to lend our kind voices to create a custom song to commemorate your special event, be it a birth or birthday, to celebrate a co-worker's years of service or a wedding anniversary, to memorialize a loved one, or to honor a dear friend. We want to create the perfect song for your special occasion. For more information, call us at 800-876-2399, extension 99, or go to our website, akindvoice.org/songs.
And we're back with A Kind Voice on Books. My name is Eden Blackwell. I'm your host. A Kind Voice is a community of volunteers who are available to have one-on-one conversations with you any time of the week at our call-in line, 1-800-876-2399. But A Kind Voice Radio is on the air from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time throughout the whole week, offering you programming on books, music, sports, employment, philosophy, and big ideas, the news. And you can call in any show at any time and discuss what's on your mind. And tonight on A Kind Voice on Books, I'm joined by Dr. John Brailsford. We're talking storytelling, and John uses storytelling in therapeutic counseling.
Yep.
And he's just telling us a little bit about how commonalities can be shared and expressed, and through storytelling, through our everyday lives and sharing the stories. And you were saying before the break, John, that it's useful in couples therapy and family therapy.
Absolutely, yeah. It helps with relationships. Sometimes it helps because people who are struggling with each other often feel that the other one is just in a completely different world from them, that they feel very separate. And sometimes what you can do with a story is you can bring people together. I should mention, by the way, that storytelling can actually is a powerful medium, but it can also be destructive. So I don't want to make it sound like stories are just wonderful, good things no matter what. Sometimes our stories can actually disguise us or hide us, not only from others but from ourselves. They have the power to lie, to give a false version of reality, to mislead people, and so we need to really, I think the most effective stories are the ones that really reflect reality as it is, and are also flexible, and realize that my perspective on my story may change over time. It may, and hopefully it will become more reflective of reality over time. And in order for that to happen, I need to be willing to, hold my thoughts lightly, not grab onto that story so tightly that I squeeze the life out of it, so to speak. And, for example, people will, have stories of victimization, or they'll have stories of that'll make it seem that their acts of abuse were actually warranted, or you see what I'm saying? And so we can have stories that reinforce things that we really probably don't want to be a part of our lives. But I like to think that most of us, when we tell our stories, we're actually just trying to share who we at least believe that we really are, and generally I think that turns out to be uplifting overall.
Well, in the sense that you hear one of those potentially destructive stories, how do you reframe it? How do you reorient the teller of the story to kind of be more aware of maybe how they're skewing things?
That's right.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just take you to therapy school here for a second.
Sure.
Excuse me. The answer to that question is there's many different ways to do that. Sometimes but obviously it's not telling them your story's messed up. As soon as you say that, it's kind of like, well, how dare you? And really, how dare I, to say such a thing? The fact is, what you can do is you can, what we call reframe. You can invite them to consider, other aspects of the story that maybe they have ignored over time. Maybe you can have them consider what they've, emphasized at the expense of those other things. And it's not to say that their story's wrong. It's very often what it is they've just focused in on aspects of their story that reinforce who they want to be rather than allowing their story to be whatever it was. And, because sometimes it's hard. Sometimes our stories are unflattering to us. Sometimes it's hard to admit that, I could have chosen a better way. Sometimes, quite honestly, our stories are too hard on us, and sometimes we need to maybe let go of some of the harshness and unkindness that we have toward ourselves and the lack of compassion. So,
and so that's a matter of perspective, then. You mean people are viewing themselves too harshly?
And it's hard to rewrite those stories sometimes when you're the one that lived them. You're convinced that you lived it just the way you're telling it. And so as a therapist, sometimes, of course, as a therapist, as a third party, it's easy to look at the story and go, wow, I think they might be embellishing that one part or not giving enough credit to that one person or to themselves. And so you're not telling them to. You're just inviting them to consider, could it be that there's a dimension of my story that I've ignored or that I've, pushed aside. And often what you'll find is if there's a good relationship between the therapist and the client, they'll be very open, to considering other options. And at worst, they just say, I think I got that part right. And then you move on. But a lot of the time what they'll say is, you know what, I think I am being too hard on myself. Looking back with what I knew at the time, I think I was doing the best I could, or they were doing the best they could, or, whatever characters were involved in the story. And as their story becomes more authentic, closer to, what really happened and representing who they truly are, generally the trend is toward more kindness, more compassion, more gentleness, and more peace and joy and all those other things, despite the challenges that came in their lives. So, and that's powerful, that can lead to some pretty powerful changes in people's lives. So,
yeah, I can imagine it, being in a group setting, if someone dear to me is sharing that story and I hear what they're honest, from their perspective, portrayal of events or relationships. That's one of the big powers. Yeah, that's one of the great strengths of group therapy, is that we're hearing a story that isn't too distant from our own, and when we hear not only how they felt defeated in some ways, but also how they triumphed, both can be really instructive to us. For someone who experienced it in a way where they didn't handle it really well, it can remind us that maybe we did better than we might have imagined, and in the sense that they really did handle it in a way that was productive, it can show us the way so we can maybe incorporate that into our own approach. So both can be really useful. So, and I've had a number of stories that I've used in therapy that, I would have thought going in that,
if you're not like a guy who grew up in a rough neighborhood, you're probably not going to get this stuff, and yet I'll share the story, and I'll get a African-American woman from Georgia to totally buy in and just say, you're talking about me, and that's what's really interesting about it.
That's really interesting. I read a story, an article last week about an Asian American man who grew up in Queens, New York, and he'd written this fabulous, critically acclaimed book about the American South in the 1920s from a poor black sharecropper's perspective. And everybody just absolutely said, there's no way. And when they, the quote-unquote authorities on that time and that kind of literature looked at it, they were pretty amazed at just how, I suppose, detailed and how authentic the perspective was.
Absolutely.
But my thought is, that takes a sensitive, observant person to be able to sort of capture that. And
right. And I think the greatest storytellers are the ones that look at their stories in an authentic way, and they're willing to share the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between. And when they do, people latch onto that. They realize, hey, this guy or this gal's being honest with me, and I can see myself in what they're saying.
That makes me think they have to be, or we have to be, good listeners to stories.
That certainly helps. Yeah. And there's things we can do as storytellers that can put people at ease so it's easier for them to listen as well, and, there's this, there's skills, that I think storytelling, if you think about it, really is a combination of all the good qualities of writing combined with the good aspects of performing, and so really it's a double, of course I think theater in general is, you would hope there's good writing, and sometimes good performing can make up for a lack of that, but storytelling is, includes sort of the narrative form and the language you use. So it's the structure of the story, it's the words you use to express, what happens in the story. It includes also, though, beyond the words and the structure, it includes your voice, the pace, your gestures, your relationship with the audience. How engaged are you with them as people? How much are you feeling for them and really enthusiastic about them becoming a part of this story? And, boy, when you combine all those elements together, it's almost like reading a good book, but it makes it easier to almost live it, Good words and structure can only go so far, but a really good storyteller can take you to a place that's beyond sometimes where you can go in a book. So, and that being said, if you know good books, I think it's easier to be a good storyteller because that piece of it you already understand. So. Right.
Well, so. I don't know necessarily tons of good books that capture storytelling, but I can think of this movie called Big Fish, and it came out maybe late 90s, early 2000s, and it was about a storyteller, a man who just spun tales, and he just couldn't relate to his family and to his world without embellishing and making a tell of everything. That was his form of communication.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, in some respects that can be very therapeutic. The downside of that, just is that it's not grounded in reality real strongly. And yet, if you think about movies and music and stuff, don't they kind of take us outside of our reality and into almost an imaginary land? It's like going to Disneyland for the day. And, we can't in real life spend every day in Disneyland, but it's nice to go there every once in a while, and so there's a place for that, I think, where you can kind of escape and embellish and do those things. The nice thing is to know deep down that you're doing that, and then as long as you know that, and you're willing to come back to reality, you're probably going to be okay.
A dose of self-awareness. Yes.
Exactly. You know, one of my favorite, I don't know if we have time to tell it, but one of my favorite stories that I share with clients, I actually, one of the things I did to survive mentally when I was a kid growing up, I grew up in a really rough neighborhood, and nature became sort of like that place. That was sort of my Disneyland. You know, we would go out into the desert, and there's a state park in north of Las Vegas called Valley of Fire. And the Valley of Fire, it's actually one of the most popular state parks in America. And if you can imagine, the three colors I would say there are red, green, and blue. And it's the red, a deep red sandstone, and a really light green, beautiful sagebrush that grows there. And then there's Lake Mead, the largest man-made lake in the world. The shores of Lake Mead are right there as well. And so it's just this really beautiful place. And we would go there, and I remember one time that we climbed one of the big sandstones, because you can go to the top of these big formations. And I would say that, you know, from the valley floor to the top of these things is anywhere from, 100 to 150 feet. You're going up in elevation, but it's this circuitous route, this back and forth you have to do to climb your way to the top, so to speak. And so we got really good at rock climbing sandstone, and so I was maybe 14. I remember we went up there right before dinner time and looked out over Lake Mead, and it was really beautiful. And on the way down, we got this bright idea that we would race back to camp, and just me and some of my buddies, and so I had this feeling inside, I'm going to lose this, because I had a couple of buddies, these skinny, wiry guys who could climb really well, and I knew they were going to beat me down. I'm more of a kind of a big, sturdy guy, and which isn't always the best body type for climbing. And so they were, sure enough, scooting away, and I was losing them, and all of a sudden I found a crack in a wall in the sandstone, and the crack went down the side of a cliff about 60 feet to the rocky bottom below. And I had this bright idea that I am going to climb down this crack on the cliff. Now, I look back now, I get the sweaty palms and scared, and but at the time I was just going with it. And that's why there's a technique you can use where you wedge your hand into a crack like that, and then you kind of bend it in such a way that it becomes so tight in the crack that it holds your weight. And so what I did is I literally went hand over hand with my feet dangling down the side of this cliff until the crack ran out.
How high up?
About 20 feet from the bottom.
Oh.
Which, at that point, I realized if I fall right now, I'm not going to die, but I'm going to be injured in such a way that maybe I would consider death as a better option. And so I just was nervous at that point. And obviously, I wasn't going to beat anybody back to camp at that point. And so there I was, and I actually found a little, almost, I called it the sling for my butt. It was like this little place where the rock came out, just large enough for my rear end to fit into it. And so I just kind of flung my hand out and sat my rear end in that little sling, that little rock outcropping, and I looked around, and there I was sitting on the side of a cliff 20 feet above solid rock. And I just thought, this is not going to be a good outcome. But it was really amazing how peaceful it became in the next few minutes. And as I calmed down and looked around, I noticed where the rock came out below me, and I thought to myself, it's just like a vision that came into my mind. If I were to jump and halfway down, I were to hit that place where the rock comes out, I think it would slow me down enough that when I hit the bottom and roll, I won't have to break anything. And sure enough, there came that moment where you just say, go, that's usually the moment when your arms won't hold your weight anymore. And sure enough, I bounce, and I got to the bottom, rolled, and I'm lying on my back looking up this 60-foot cliff that I had just climbed down, realizing I had survived with just some bruising on the bottom of my feet was all. And to me, that was a very powerful experience that really grabbed my attention. The thing I share with clients when I tell that story, now you would think that story wouldn't appeal to somebody, from another place, or that no one would really understand that. That's something that happened to a 14-year-old kid from North Vegas. But people really relate to the fear that they would feel. They can relate to times in their lives when maybe they didn't make the best choices, when that little voice that kind of holds you back sometimes wasn't speaking really loudly, and yet at the same time that there's hope even when all seems lost. And so basically they come to you at a time when you're a therapist, when their rear end's in the sling, when they're hanging from the side of a cliff, and they don't see a really good outcome possible. And what you're telling them is, could it be that at the end of this process, we find ourselves lying gently in the shadows looking up at the cliff that seemed like it may have killed us at one point, and here we are, and we're still intact. So that's how story, can help people understand. Now, usually what I'll do is I'll tell a story, and I won't tell them the meaning at all. I'll ask them to consider the meaning. Sometimes I'll ask them to consider the meaning for a week and come back and tell me in the next session. The point being, they might find meaning I never even knew was in the story.
Right. Perspective.
Exactly. They'll find their own perspective. They'll say, if I had been in that situation, here's what my fears would have been. Here's, what I would have done. Sometimes maybe I would have really punished myself and been really harsh on myself. And what good would that have done? And I can see how you got out of it by getting peaceful, accepting the situation you were in, not getting overwhelmed. And then it allowed you to look at all the possibilities and find a way out without being hurt. And it might be that I never, really put it that way, even though I'm the one that lived the experience.
That's an amazing tool. I wonder, can you do it without a therapist?
Absolutely.
A person
with
knowing the problem, like, this is my problem, and I just got to reframe it. I got to take myself out of it. I mean, what's the process? Probably a good way to go. I use an approach that's really helpful to people, and maybe I could just share a couple of books that people could read that could really help them. Absolutely.
These books actually, you'll find in this approach that there's actually an emphasis sometimes on not telling too many stories, on not getting too caught up in your story, which I absolutely love, and I think that's true. That being said, we're going to tell stories whether they're good for us or not. So we might as well use our natural desire to tell them in a way that benefits us. But there is a guy named Russ Harris who has written a few books, and they all rhyme. And we can go ahead and put these on the site, too, so people can look at them later. But one of his books is called The Happiness Trap.
The Happiness Trap. So that site is going to be our Goodreads. You're going to make a recommendation on our Goodreads site.
Yeah, I'll give you 3 of them, and they all rhyme, and they're all by Russ Harris. And the first one is The Happiness Trap. The second one is The Confidence Gap.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one I'll share is one he wrote more recently called The Reality Slap.
All right.
And he just has a nice way. He tells his story, too. and in a really amazing way, in a useful way that really teaches these principles that these are what we call mindfulness approaches to therapy, and they include like acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, but you don't need to know those. Just know that they use mindfulness practices and principles, so things that we learn from meditation, from Eastern approaches that actually help people overcome their challenges and really create a life that they really want. And but Russ has a really nice way of sharing that, and he uses story in a really powerful way. So I really recommend those books, and that'll introduce you through his experiences to a really powerful approach to creating a better life.
Cool, thank you. Well, why don't we take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll talk just a little bit more and wrap up our show on storytelling and ask about some ways to get involved in storytelling. So everybody, come on back. We'll take a few minutes break.
Great.
Hi, this is Bruce Grahamel. I wrote my song, The Alchemy of Kindness, after I became familiar with the organization called A Kind Voice. A Kind Voice is a community of volunteers that provide the opportunity for conversation on a variety of topics. The title is one of their slogans, and the phrase really hits home with me. I hope that you'll enjoy my song, and whether you may be a caller or a future volunteer, I hope you'll take the time to find out more about the wonderful folks at A Kind Voice.
The alchemy of kindness is one that we believe. When we reach out to each other, you know we both receive. We're always here for you. We're right beside the phone. When kind voices come together, it seems we're never alone. So if you're reaching out, you know we're reaching too. Pick up the phone, that's all you have to do. Call us now if you need a kind voice. If you need a kind voice. If you've got some good news you heard the other day. Maybe you read a good book you finished yesterday. How was that new movie you finally went to see? Is your favorite sports team as good as they should be? If you're feeling down and lonely, a friendly voice is just a call away. Call us now if you need a kind voice. If you need a kind voice. That new class you picked is harder than you thought. You got a good deal on the new car you bought. Your family's not home and your friends are away. Your daughter just called, your grandson took his first steps today. Sometimes we just need someone to talk to. You know we all need someone who listens well. Call us now if you need a kind voice. When you want a kind voice. When you need a kind voice. When you want a kind voice. Call us now if you need a kind voice. A Kind Voice Radio.
Welcome back to A Kind Voice on Books. I'm Eden Blackwell, your host, and I've been chatting with John Brailsford about storytelling and its therapeutic uses. And John, we have a question from David. David,
okay.
Are you there?
Hey, John, enjoying the conversation. Are you familiar with the story Stone Soup?
I am not. But you're certainly free to tell me about it. I'd like to hear it.
The simple version is that soldiers came to a community and all the doors were closed, and they would be knocking on the doors and asking people for some stones to make soup. And gradually they said, stones are nice, but we also need maybe a little bit of carrot or a little bit of parsley. And gradually people came out of their homes and donated a little bit of the ingredients. And then at the end, they took the stones out of the soup and made a nice stew for the whole community to share when everyone was locked into their own homes in the beginning.
That's great. Yeah.
So I kind of view that as a true story in that it didn't actually have to happen to be true, but it's something that could be relived in many different formats.
Absolutely. And, it speaks to issues, like us being hungry for something, and it doesn't even have to be soup. It could be knowledge, or it could be someone to care about us, or, you can take a story like that and find the meaning, even if you've never been a soldier, you didn't live in that time, you've never been starving, and yet almost all of us have starved for something, I know a lot of us have gone hungry for a while, too. So it could apply directly, or it could apply, in an indirect way, too.
Is there worth for those kinds of stories that could be relived?
I don't know that there's a specific name. Of course, we give names like, metaphor and symbolism, and we talk about parables and simile. And to me, what it basically means is that I hear a story that may seem to have nothing to do with me, and yet it symbolizes or represents something that means a lot to me. And the best stories, I think, are the ones that have a common theme or a core message that is as close to universal as you can get. So it would speak to, someone living in Nepal just as easy as it would somebody living in L.A.
Interesting. Okay, well, I appreciate you guys taking my call.
Yep,
Thank
no problem.
you, David. That's a really interesting angle, the social cause, and applying stories to that. I know in work I've done with nonprofits or maybe trying to get a message out to people who can help. The guidance is just tell your story. Just tell the funder why you need the money. Tell them what it's going to do and what it'll mean and how it will affect, an everyday life.
Not only your life, but every life that will be touched by your work. And if they catch a vision of, how that will influence people, they might, they'll look at that and just say, so for this small investment of my time, my energy, my resources, I could contribute to something that will keep touching lives long after I'm gone. And, when you put it that way, whether it's an hour of their time or $20 or whatever it is, well, gee, that seems relatively inexpensive. So yeah, it can be a powerful tool for rallying people, to our cause. Absolutely.
Right. I see a lot of that right now. In the past few years have been, there's just been so much social change. I'm thinking immigration reform, and there's both sides of that. There,
right.
People who live along the border, and then there are people who are just trying desperately to cross the border, and people who've been here and grown up here, but are maybe illegal aliens, and they all have these really compelling stories. It's so easy.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's such a powerful tool.
And listen, landowners that have tried to work their land, and yet it gets, people are coming into their space, and there's frustration on both sides, and people who long for a better solution on both sides, And I think what happens is, but notice what we often do. We just tell the facts. We just tell what our position is. And when you do that directly, what's the immediate response? Resistance. You know, even people we agree with will sometimes resist when they just tell us the idea straight up. But when they will tell us a story, here's how I came to this position. All of a sudden, even if I continue to disagree with the position, it will humanize it for me, and I'll look at that person in a different light. And then all of a sudden, what I find myself doing is, even though I come from a different perspective and have a different position, I'll find myself almost wanting to help them find a solution that's closer to their point of view, you know, even if it works against what I perceive to be my own interest in some ways. And then what you end up having is this beautiful combination of everyone's ideas in such a way that a truly meaningful solution comes about. It might not necessarily be what we consider the best solution, but it's the solution, it's the best in the sense that it'll be supported by the widest number of people. And once you got that, it's a definite improvement. So.
Right. Well, you know, how do we get to be better storytellers? You mentioned Timpanogos Storytelling Festival and the International Storytelling Festival. Are there actual, you know, I guess, seminars?
Yeah, and probably the best way is to get with your local organization, and that might be a guild or an association, or you can go to the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival website, and that's at timpfest.org, and you'll find that on the materials associated with this show. And there's also storytellingcenter.net, which is where the information on the National Storytelling Festival is. Let me give you another website that might be really good. If you're looking for organizations to become a part of, that would be what's called the National Storytelling Network. And you find that at storynet.org. Okay. And at that website, you'll notice that down the list on the left, there will be a place where you can find resources. And so it'll have links to resources is on that list. And at the very top of the resource page, there's a link that says Storytelling Organizations Listed by State. And that will bring up all the states, all 50 states, and then you just click on your state, and there you'll see different guilds and associations and organizations and alliances. You know, they go by different names. And just click on the one closest to you, and or if they don't have a link, you can just go ahead and they'll have a phone number or something where you can get a hold of them and just invite them to share information and ask them how you can get involved.
That's cool. We'll explore that. We'll put that up on the Kind Voice good reads at the very least, so people can find that there. So, you know, I was trying to think of other ways that we might be bumping into storytelling and not realize it. And I always think this time of year, getting around a campfire, getting on a hayride, and having a scary story because it's the season. But another way of storytelling that's really important, at least for history, is the historic reenactment. You know, where people dress up in hoop skirts or uniforms, and they kind of reenact either wars or just, you know, what it's like to be Benjamin Franklin. And I'm just thinking of all the stuff along the East Coast where people kind of actually enacted daily life and then paused and then, oh, hey, there's this random group of tourists. I'll just tell them what life's like. And it's such a cool, I mean, it's very visual, and there's all this great setting, and there's the opportunity to then just kind of, you know, share a historic event and moment, and it's really cool. I think that would be fun for anybody who had kind of an itch to get into period clothing and to act a little, to tell stories.
Well, and that's the thing. It takes you into a different time, a different experience, and yet you identify with those people, even though it was a very different time. And that's what's amazing about storytelling, is it helps expand your sense of self and realize there is more to me than this little story I told myself, and there are dimensions of my own story. My story is connected to every other story. And once you realize that, it really helps you become a more well-rounded, expansive, engaged human being, and that can be really powerful. And whether you're reading that in a book or watching someone tell it on a stage, that's the power of story, to change our lives for the better. So, there's some really great storytellers. If I could just name drop a couple people, if you look up,
go ahead.
Bill Harley is one of my favorites. He actually used music. He's really great with kids, but he will play that guitar and tell a story in a song that's a really amazing thing. And that's the thing, too, is sometimes people use music to do the telling. And then there's also a guy named Andy Offit Irwin, Irwin, and we can go ahead and put these names in the information related to this show as well. But
absolutely.
And then my favorite, this is a guy from down south, Donald Davis. Boy, that guy can just tell a story and leave you laughing or crying, in a way that I think it's almost hard for a book to do sometimes, although really good writers can make that happen too. But anyway, those are just some of the names of people that have this ability to bring you into a world they want to take you to and help you discover yourself there. And I think that's the key to good storytelling.
Are there stories like contemporary, or are they? For some reason, I always imagine they're telling them about pioneer days or trapper days, and
right. And you know what? Sometimes there are storytellers who are almost reenact historical events. So that's one. I guess that would be a genre within the genre. But my favorite storytellers are telling stories from their own life, to be quite honest. And what I find is they're telling my story. I might not have known it when they started the story, but they're telling something that was really deeply meaningful to them, or really funny to them, or really sad to them. And in the telling of it, in a really effective way, they're kind of getting you to examine your own life and explore aspects of your life that you maybe hadn't considered for a really long time. Maybe they take you back to your childhood. Maybe they take you, to a faraway war that they experienced, or maybe a heartache in a relationship, or maybe just something really hilarious that happened, their first day of college, or when they started their business, or something like that, where you say, "Oh my gosh, that's exactly the kind of thing that happened to me when I did the same." And as soon as they do that, they got you. And once they got you, into that world, all of a sudden, it becomes a transformative experience. And I'll hear a good story, and I'll go home, and it might be weeks or months later, and I'll think back on that experience, and I'll learn something new, So, And isn't a good book like that too?
It is for me.
Absolutely.
What is storytelling like? I mean, it's with children. Do you have to approach it differently? I mean, they're so open to believing just about anything, but they're also pretty sneaky on detail. You got to be
right.
In my experience, you got to know what you're saying. Don't get your lines crossed.
Right. Don't think you can pull the wool over their eyes. In fact, I would say in some ways children are more perceptive about when you're not being genuine. That being said, if you are genuine and you really are pouring out your soul, I think they'll jump right into it and go. And they'll get into that place. I think for them, what they like it a little more animated, and nothing. The words not so fancy. For them, I think it's more about the emotion behind the words, and not the words themselves that matter. They love music. If you can put it to song And especially if it's a upbeat and funny song, oh my goodness, they will eat that alive. So, and it can. But think about that too. Some of my favorite moments in my life were telling stories to my children as they went to bed. And in fact, I just, as you were mentioning, telling stories to our children, I just thought of my great uncle had a cabin up on the other side of Mount Timpanogos. And my dad used to tell us Bigfoot stories, and you could tell as I look back that he was making them up as he went along, kind of thing. And they'd always have this scary ending with Bigfoot looking through our window, or something like that. And there we were up in the dark mountain, with nobody around us and very few lights, and it just it made that experience so much more meaningful. So.
That's another cool aspect of storytelling is sort of the regional beast. Lately down in my area, there's been a few chupacabra sightings, and so a lot of older people, who've been around for a couple more chupacabra sightings have kind of gotten in talking about seeing them out in the swamp, or one running across the pasture with a chicken in its mouth, and just. It's incredible how many chupacabras there are running around this county. But
and it enlivens their imagination and lets them enjoy their lives. When you share those things with children. So we're probably getting close to the end, aren't we?
Absolutely, John. It's been fabulous talking to you about storytelling. Clearly, there's so many ways that storytelling can really add to daily life, and I appreciate you telling us about them. Is there anything you want to leave us with, or have we?
I don't know that I would add anything more other than to just say that the most important story to use, the story of your life, and probably the best way for that to influence your life from this moment on is for you to look at that life in a very sincere and open and honest way. Take the good with the bad, and then take what you learned and apply it. And in this very moment, the only moment you have complete control over is right now. So
that's great advice. That's awesome. Thank you, Dr. John Brailsford, for being with us tonight. We've absolutely enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks, Eden.
Take care.
Bye.
And for you at home, we're going to take a short break. Please call in and tell me your story. Our number is 347-850-8907. We're here to talk books, but we can talk about any way that you relate to books and your own personal story of finding a great one, what it means to your life. I'd love to hear a good story. So come on back. If you got a story, I'll listen to it. And otherwise, I've got some information on ways that you can share your story and ways to be interactive with us between Wednesdays. So come on back after the break.
Your sister has a birthday. She's 39 again. Get her something special. She's your best friend. Your father is retiring after all these years. Show him just how proud you are in front of all his peers. Let us write you a song. They'll hear a kind voice and they'll want to sing along. Let us write you a song. It's coming from the heart and that can never be wrong. Your friend is gonna graduate. She finally made it through. Why don't you give her something special now? It's such a sweet thing to do. If your anniversary's coming up for you and your bride, let her know what it means to you to have her there by your side. Let us write you a song. They'll hear a kind voice and they want to sing along. Let us write you a song. It's coming from the heart and that can never be wrong.
Be it a birth or birthday, a wedding or wedding anniversary, to celebrate a coworker's years of service, or to honor a dear friend. We'll create the perfect song for your special person or occasion. For more information, please visit the Song Request tab at akindvoice.org or call us at 800-876-2399, extension 99, and we'll get started.
Let us write you a song. They'll hear a kind voice and you know they'll want to sing along. Let us write you a song. It's coming from the heart and you know that can never be wrong. Let us write you a song. From the radio with a kind voice.
Welcome back to A Kind Voice on Books. This is Eden Blackwell, your host. Tonight we've been talking about storytelling. We've had Dr. John Brailsford from the Provo, Utah area. He's been on sharing with us his experience with storytelling as an art, but also its therapeutic uses, the way that we can relate with family members and friends, and maybe just explore and re-examine our own lives through stories. And we've all got stories to tell, whether they're embarrassing moments that we can now, appreciate for what they are and laugh about, or whether they are stories of personal triumph or struggle, or, the happiest days of our lives, or just an everyday encounter. We've got those stories, and we can learn so much by sharing them and by listening to others and their stories. And I want to give you an opportunity or a resource for telling your story, because it's valuable, and there's a lot people can learn from you. And we at A Kind Voice on books and A Kind Voice on movies and philosophy and the whole week through would love to hear your stories. So call us from 7 to 8 p.m. Every night and share those with us. But in between shows and opportunities, you can explore storytelling through StoryCorps at storycorps.org. That's StoryCorps.org. And StoryCorps is very cool, I think. It's one of the largest oral history projects, gathering personal stories and experiences of anybody who will take the time to share it. Anybody off the street can approach a StoryCorps location and record a personal experience. And you may be familiar with this if you listen to public radio programming. StoryCorps does receive some funding. It's a nonprofit, so it does receive some funding through federal and state sources, and it partners with National Public Radio. But since 2003, StoryCorps has collected and archived over 30,000 interviews from more than 60,000 participants. So if you do your math right, you can see that there are more interviews than participants. Well, one really cool thing about StoryCorps is that it captures family members or friends from time to time sharing stories between themselves. So a mother relating to her daughter a growing up experience, or a personal struggle, or best friends kind of sharing a story or an experience they shared together, maybe in college, or some political event that they were a part of, but meaningful parts of their lives that they're burning to share and that they think can be valuable. And that you don't have to be the first person to summit a mountain to share your story on StoryCorps. A lot of the stories talk about growing up experiences and celebrating differences, maybe as a minority in a community where there are a few like you, and but how that provided strength or that was a source for humor. People are relating those kinds of stories. They're relating stories from their time in the military, or their coming out experience, or their participation in historical moments, or their struggle and triumph over disease, or their story of loss or of happiness. Every story is valuable, and StoryCorps at storycorps.org is a resource for you. There are 4 locations. There's one in Atlanta, Chicago, San Francisco, and actually the 4th one is mobile. So who knows where it is tonight, but you have 4 outlets to go in and record your story, and the country and society will be richer for it. And also, if you just want to interview your family members or your friends, or and to kind of pull out their stories and get them to tell you about those pivotal moments or those simply beautiful moments in their lives, there are resources for you, lists of questions for how to begin, and ways for maybe children to approach older adults and family members to kind of get them to share their stories with a new generation. So that's an awesome resource, and it's out there and for you to explore. And, of course, you are so welcome always to call us and share your stories. At A Kind Voice on Books, we'd love to hear those. I'm going to put these resources up on our Goodreads page. They'll also be available on A Kind Voice on Facebook. I'll make a post for these, as well as Dr. John's resources for the National Storytelling Fest and the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival. All of that is available. And Dr. John is going to join our Goodreads group, which is called A Kind Voice on Books, and you can search for it at www.goodreads.com. And check out Bookshelf. Every host who comes on the show that makes a recommendation, they're going to put their books on the bookshelf. And Dr. John's books are going to be listed for you to explore when you have time. And while you're there, say hello. Drop a comment. Make friends with other members in the groups. Tell me what you think about a book. Share your ideas for new content for the show. I would love to explore the opportunity to run a book club, both online and then on the show. And then if you'd like to review a book, it might be cool as a member of A Kind Voice on Books to review books for new writers out there who are looking for some insight. So I'd like to facilitate that for you if you'd like through our Goodreads group. So there are lots of cool ways to kind of stay with it throughout the week from between Wednesdays until we meet again next Wednesday. And so that's it. That's storytelling. That's our Goodreads. I want you to be a part of it. I want to hear from you, and I want you to share as much as you like. And so join us next week on A Kind Voice on Books, airing at the same time, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm Eden Blackwell, and it has been my pleasure to be with you tonight. Have a good one.
Well, hello, fellow soldier, how's your day? Come take my arm, let's walk and sink away. I want to know your thoughts now, yes it's true. And that bluebird, he flew by now just for you. You step outside, you don't know who you'll meet. Feel the pitter patter of the street. Join the crowd and sing in harmony. I won't let go, come link elbows with me. Just know that I am there for you, to hear your voice, care to lend a hand. In this moment, we will work together and turn a new kind stranger to a friend. alone, searching for a place to call home. The path is long, we cannot see the end, but the journey's so much better with a friend. Come to my house and rest those weary bones. We'll drink and laugh, we'll both refill our souls. That cup of cheer you're drinking sure tastes sweet. I'm glad that your acquaintance sided me. Ooh, and you know that I am there for you, to hear your voice, care to lend a hand. In this moment, we'll work together to turn a new kind stranger to a friend. Ooh, and you know that I am there for you, to hear your voice, to care to lend a hand. In this moment, we'll work together to turn a new kind stranger to a friend.